Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and why the best writers risk being strange. And today, the writer I want to talk about is myself, and I want to talk about Last Breeds, the new book that I have coming out. It's will be available in the future everywhere books are sold, but right now you can only get it from me and from the publisher, Gungnir Books, directly. So if you are online on YouTube or watching on the video scroll of Spotify, I will be showing you some things on the screen. So, you may want to take a look at just your video if, the way that you're listening to this podcast allows you to use video, or you may want to go to my YouTube channel at strangertv.com. If you go to strangertv.com, it'll take you to the YouTube channel where you can see some of these visuals that I'm going to discuss. But for those of you who are just listening, I'll make sure I describe everything so that you're not left out. But, just worth noting the option if you have the video option, but normally are listening to the audio. What I've got in my hands here is Last Breeds, the new book that I have co-created with an illustrious crew. The three sort of core writers on this book are not just myself, but Matthew Medney, who is the former CEO of Heavy Metal, now, the publisher of Gungnir, and a writer of many great books. His new book they just announced is co-written with Bobby Lee. He's done a lot of co-created projects and, many of his own projects in many respects. Matthew Medney, really an interesting author worth checking out. And his new book, Last Breeds, was co-created with myself and Gregory Chomichuk. So Matt, Gregory, and I all sort of share a writing credit on this book. We are all sort of the storytellers. We're all people involved in the writing process. But then I myself would draft the script or the story based on our discussions. And I'll talk a bit more about that process in the course of this podcast. But I just want to point out that, although I'm listed as the writer or the words, the credit I have in the book is Words by Jonathan Ball. It's worth pointing out that in a certain sense, I'm not the only writer on this book. I'm not the only one coming up with the words. Gregory and Matt really, and I did co-create and co-write the story. But I have, this particular part of the process, this role I occupied, where I was a bit more engaged with the words you see on the page on a certain level. I'll talk about that process and how I fit into it. I'm going to talk about it with an eye to you as a writer. How could you work into a writing team? How can you work into a writing process? How can you create a writing workflow? What are sort of things I've learned from that whole experience of creating Last Breeds? And so I think it'll be useful and interesting to you if you're a writer who wants to co-write something, who wants to be part of a team of writers, but who maybe also, has their own thing going. I think if you're interested in Last Breeds as a book, if you're interested in my work or the work of the other creators involved in Last Breeds, and you just want to know more about this super cool graphic novel we've got out, or this comic book that's here / coming, it's going to be useful and interesting to you. I'm going to talk really specifically about a couple moments in the book, just to sort of show you, again, how the writing process of a comic script writer working in a team, how that connects to, the other team members involved in this book. Because me, Matt, and Gregory, again, we're all sort of in the writing process. We're all sort of leading the charge of this book, the core kind of initiating creatives. But then, to get the book made, of course, we are taking on some additional roles. So sort of Matthew, of course, in taking on the role of the publisher in this particular instance. We ultimately decided rather than take the book somewhere else, we would take it out via Matt's publishing company. So Matt, was in addition to being a writer on this and having the initial idea, sort of the initiating creator in that sense, also as a publisher. I was sort of more of a project manager as well as a writer involved in the project. Gregory was also the art director, managing not the project so much, which was more my management purview, but managing the team. Gregory really got the team together on the art side. For example, he spent a lot of time interviewing, and going through testing colorists. Eventually, we landed on Zach Schuster as the colorist. Me and Gregory, but Gregory more so than I, got Scott Henderson involved as the artist on this project. Gregory himself is an artist. Gregory does some art pages in the book. So if you go through the book, there are these ad pages, sort of, fictional ads from the fictitious world, where that's sort of set into a dystopian future. So just before that collapse of the civilization, there's sort of a timeline of before the collapse of the civilization, and we have some sort of ads from that timeline pulled into, the book, and sort of adding some context for the world. So I'll get a bit more into kind of how the writing of those worked and how it would, play out. But the point is, Gregory did a lot of that artwork, most of that artwork, those ad pages, but then the majority of the artwork on the book itself and actually the storytelling of the plot is all being done by Scott Henderson, who then again, his art is being colored by Zach Schuster. And then on top of that, it's being lettered by Lyndon Radchenka, who is a writer in his own right. Lyndon is also a writer, but he worked a lot on this book as a letterer. He was the letterer. And then also he did some of the book design elements. Some of that was taken over at a later date by Matt's company, and so on. But when we're talking about Last Breeds, again, it's a team effort. I want to talk about working as a writer on a team. I want to talk specifically about some of the particular ways that comics writing works, things to think about, things I was thinking about while kind of building a script, and then looking at how that script translates in a creative process to, the final page. How the other contributions of the team members come into play, and so on and so forth. So all that's what we're going to dig into today. If you're watching on the screen, you'll see I'm holding in my hand a slipcase. This is a great, hard magnetic slipcase that Gungnir Press, all of its, premier publications have these great slipcases. They're a little bit different for every book. You can see if you're looking online that Last Breeds is written on the one of the decorations of this, really cool high quality slipcase. If I open it up, take out of the slipcase the book, we have here Last Breeds. So this is a hardcover book. Again, Gungnir Press, Gungnir Books has published this beautiful premium hardcover graphic novel, or comics novel, as I like to call them. You'll see the whole team is listed on the book. It's Medney, Chomichuk, Ball, Henderson, Schuster, Radchenka. We really wanted to make sure all the core creatives were listed on that book. The cover I'm holding in my hands is Scott Henderson's cover. So this is the artist who's inside the book. This is the cover that he made. But there are two other covers for this book. Mohammed Samah did a great cover that you'll see kind of more on the store shelves. And then Gregory Chomichuk himself did a cover as well. So there's sort of three covers for this book. This slipcase, by the way, is more of an exclusive if you're getting the book from, the press. You look at the slipcase. We've got slipcases too, kicking around in Winnipeg here. If you're looking online on the video, this is the Chomichuk cover. Gregory, again, is one of the artists in this book, although not the main artist. But he did his own cover for the book, which I really love. And you'll see all the names down here. We really wanted to keep all the names on here. A lot of times in books in the trade channel, if you go to a bookstore and you pick up a graphic novel, you won't often see like the letterer listed on the cover. You might not. The colorist may or may not be listed on the cover. We kind of felt it was important to list people, because we really like to do that whenever possible. Because the colorist as the letterer, these are as much part of the team as anyone else on the team. Even though, of course, Henderson as the artist is sort of the main figure on that art team. This other book I'm opening up, if you're looking at the video, is the cover by Muhammad, which is the cover A, sort of the more of a retail cover. So these are sort of the books. And I'm going to show on my screen a little later some of the interior. I'm not going to get too deep into the interior of the book right now, because of course this is an audio podcast primarily. So I will sort of show some stuff on screen, but again, if you're listening along, I'll show some of my script, but I will read it out loud so you don't have to be looking at the screen. I'll show some of the pages from the interiors, but I'll also describe the salient points. So you don't have to be listening or you don't have to be watching necessarily. But if you do want to watch, again, go to strangertv.com. That's where you can find, my YouTube channel for Stranger Fiction and, this video and many others. Now, a thing that I really think is important to note is, again, sort of how the writing process worked and how that team was sort of built in a certain sense. So this project, Last Breeze, really initiated with Matthew Medney. So we were, at the time that me and Gregory connected to Matthew, what had happened was he had become the CEO of heavy metal. So just sort of give you a bit of a project backstory here. So Matthew has become the CEO of heavy metal. He had previous to that had his own press called Hero Projects. And a lot of what Hero Projects did was partner with celebrities in the sports world or in music, especially because Matt kind of comes out of a music promotion background. And he started at a certain point, kind of combining his love of comics with music. He did some comic books for bands, and he kind of started this Hero Projects company. Sometime after that, he becomes the CEO of heavy metal. So at the time that me and Gregory connect to him, it's through heavy metal, because what we had done was heavy metal had announced that they were going to start a line of comics and graphic novels, and they had started to put out some single issue comics and then collect them as graphic novels. And so me and Gregory, this is the Virus Comics line that heavy metal was doing at the time, creator-owned comics. Now, me and Gregory, being massive fans of heavy metal ever since childhood, not only did we want to kind of be part of heavy metal, which we loved, but also we saw, they had this creator-owned thing going on, and they were starting out. And we were sort of, as we were looking around for a home for our book, The Eye Collector, we just sort of saw what they were doing, and we saw what Matt at the time, as one in charge of heavy metal, was doing, and we really, clicked with what we thought the vision there was. And then we submitted, and then were accepted by heavy metal, and the book was slated for publication. Now, that iCollector has a very complex publication history, which I don't want to get into. But the point is, we met Matthew in this way. He had, as a CEO of Heavy Metal, accepted our work for publication. Done a deal with us, which we were very happy with. Negotiated with us, we felt very fairly compared to maybe what we were used to, with some of our experiences in the comics industry. And we, leading up to sort of the getting that book out, we kept having these meetings with Matt, and we were really sort of vibing with him, if that makes sense. So we just liked, we were getting a lot more hands-on treatment from the CEO of Heavy Metal than we expected. And we kind of started to realize at a certain point, like, well, this guy just seems to like what we are doing here. And he seems to like us, maybe, we can start lining up something else with Heavy Metal. And so thinking, that we were enjoying this whole process of working with Matt in this capacity, we thought to ourselves, well, we had also seen that he was doing work as a writer with Heavy Metal. And so we kind of thought to ourselves, I wonder if there's something that he's got in process where we could, help it out. Maybe we could get a gig, in other words, doing some work on a Heavy Metal project. It was kind of what we were thinking. So we had this discussion with Matt at one point about some other business thing that was going on. But then I remember at the end of the discussion, we just sort of asked him, hey, Matt, is there anything that you're doing that, Gregory asked him the question, do you have a project where you wish you were working on it, but you can't because you don't have time? And Matt kind of started talking about this idea he had, which then became Last Breeds. And he described it as, there's this asshole Tarzan, this guy who's got, he starts like sort of laying out the parameters of the Last Breeds premise. And Last Breeds sort of involves, this sort of dystopian future where there's been some sort of travesty. You have this guy who's kind of a superhero-ish, anti-hero figure. He's like kind of like a superhero comic vibe, but he's not really a great dude. He's kind of, a real anti-hero figure. He's got to sort of get, but for whatever reason, he's got this, these animals, so he has kind of a pack of predator animals, like tigers, lions, eagles, whatever, bears, gorillas. He's got these like kind of large, powerful predator animals. He's sort of in charge of them and can control them in some manner, and so on and so forth. And he sort of laid out some of the kind of core ideas that then later became Last Breeds, because what happened was he kind of laid out some of the ideas. Me and Gregory kind of like caught a couple things there that we were really interested in. But at the same time, we were sort of thinking, like there's some problems with this idea, technically speaking. So Gregory immediately was like, after we had ended the call with Matt, he kind of like turned to me and he's like, he goes, I kind of think there's something there in that Last Breeds idea. He goes, but I can't be the one to draw it because I just can't draw all those animals all the time. He goes, it would just not work. He goes, it's too much work to draw animals to start with. And, he goes, and they wouldn't, to do it the way that I would do it, it just wouldn't work out, I don't think, visually. He goes, but what about Scott Henderson? And he goes, what if we could get Scott Henderson on this book? And we could kind of take this idea and run with it, get Scott involved. He goes, I can, art director Scott, I can talk to Scott about how I think we want it to be. I can give him some hints about how to, not spend too much time for what we could pay him on these panels, but still make him look great and so on and so forth. Scott ended up ignoring all that advice, by the way. Gregory had all these ideas for Scott about how he could save time drawing panels by not, having detailed backgrounds or, doing this way, doing that way. But of course, Scott ignored all that and just started doing extreme detail, if you look at the book, you'll see is incredibly detailed art with so much going on. He just really did an incredible job with it. And, I wish we had paid him twice as much money because he really did that much work. But, it just wasn't going to happen, unfortunately, with the budget we had. But regardless, initially though, Gregory had the idea of like, I'll direct Scott a bit more than, maybe he ended up doing. Um, and then we weren't sure, how the coloring would work. We had the idea uh, early on that there had to be something interesting going on with the coloring. That kind of became its own thing where we got Zach Schuster involved, and we always worked with Lyndon as a letterer, so that was, just an easy thing. But anyway, we had sort of had this. We ended up going back to Matt a little bit later, saying, with we and Gregory went out, we took what Matt had said, we fleshed the idea out a bit more fully. We kind of started to plot it out a little bit in its broad strokes. Then we went back to Matt with what we had kind of done in the meantime. And we had sort of a meeting with him where the three of us all sort of discussed two things. One, we sort of discussed like, here's kind of where we see this idea going, Matt. And then he started, plus wanting, adding to our ideas. We sort of, as a group of the three of us, me, Matt, and Gregory, we started to kind of really drum up the core outlines of the story and how like the story could work. And then we also kind of drummed out how the team might work and sort of how ownership would work. And what would happen if we disagreed about something, how voting on it would work, and things like that. And if you are a writer who's going to work in a team capacity and work with other writers, or even just work on a creative team where you're the only writer, but other people are involved in the creative process, these are the kinds of discussions that it's really important to have early on. It's really before we really started writing on this in a serious way. We had a few meetings where we batted ideas about and talked about, how could it work on a practical level? How could it work artistically as a story, but how could it also work practically speaking? And how would the writing process work? Who would be in charge of what? And so on and so forth. The earlier you have those sorts of discussions and the earlier you set expectations for, who's going to do what, whose responsibility is it to do X or Y or Z, the less likely you are to have conflicts further down the process. And then another thing we did early on was we had, again, before we really started writing in a serious manner, we got a legal agreement where we just all agreed in a kind of contracty way these exact things: who was responsible for what, who was going to own what, how would voting work, if there was a disagreement, how would that work, and so on and so forth. We made a real concrete plan for kind of how things would go. We made a real concrete plan for how money would work. We made a real concrete kind of plan for how would things work, creatively speaking, like on the process, who's going to do what are the credits going to be. We had all those credits sorted out before anything really happened. Again, all that time up front where you're not writing, but you're kind of just getting the team together in that sense and getting the expectations of who's going to do what and who's responsible for what, whose job it is to do X versus Y and so on. The more time you spend up front figuring those things out, and then if you think, well, what happens if this goes wrong? How happens if we don't want to work together anymore? What happens if we never finish the project? Who owns it, the half-finished project? What happens, if it goes really well? What happens if it goes really poorly? The more you kind of think and talk about those things before they happen, the more prepared you are for those sorts of things to happen. And so we had a pretty smooth sailing with last periods, more or less, because we did all that work up front. It would have been very easy, when disagreements arose, which they did, to figure out. It would have been easy for things to dissolve. So the coloring is a good example. So at one point, um, early on, initially, we had the idea that Scott might be the one coloring these pages. But we Gregory and Matt sort of started to have some other ideas about how coloring would go. And they started to sort of talk a bit about that in our meetings about how they saw the coloring working. And they were sort of on the same wavelength with it. I didn't really see what they meant. Like I could kind of understand conceptually what they meant, but I didn't really have a great vision of what they meant. I couldn't see it in my mind's eye the way that they seemed to be seeing it. And then I didn't, and then, Gregory, had tested out some colorists and he would show me versions of like what they had done. And I would look at them and I would think, it's very well done, but I don't really know if it's working. I don't know if I see it. And he would sort of agree. He's like, yeah, I agree with you that it's not really working. It's not exactly there. He goes, but don't worry, it'll work, it'll work, it'll work, kind of thing. And, I was sort of halfway there. I was kind of skeptical. I was kind of, eventually we hit on Zach Schuster as a colorist, and he really hit the mark for what Gregory wanted, and what Matt sort of, wanted. I started to see it at that point, but I wasn't seeing it as much as they were, if that makes sense. I kind of understood it and I saw it, but I was a little worried about how it would play in certain ways and so on. And so I was a bit hesitant. I'll say not, I mean, any of the colorists that Gregory brought to me were great colorists, and I would have been fine hiring them. Zach, I was very pleased with it. He was the one whose work I liked the best. But again, I didn't know if it was a situation where I liked it, but no one else would like it, and it was going to maybe hurt the book, or I was kind of concerned about a couple things. And then, to be totally transparent, Scott wasn't thrilled with how the colors were going. But, we had already made agreements for what would happen in these sorts of scenarios. And these sorts of scenarios, Scott doesn't get a vote. Gregory and Matt and me, two can outvote the other. So we kind of ended up in a situation where we're sort of, torn on the artistic level about, how the colors were going to work. But, we had a clear process in place for making those decisions. I just sort of had to, deal with it, as did Scott. And ultimately, I think, it all worked out. Everybody looks good. I look like a genius because, Scott's work looks great and all that stuff. But, if that's the kind of discussion that could have ended the book, where people aren't all seeing exactly eye to eye, and if there was no process for how to move forward that had been pre-agreed to, now you got, to deal with the situation you're in. So because we had that process, at a certain point, I was like, well, I don't know if I 100% agree with this, but it is what it is. Let's just, my responsibility, my job at this point is to be the project manager and just move things forward after the decision has been made, rather than, going back to the decision in my, own head. And so anytime I would kind of have a doubt about things, I would just have to kick it out of my mind and move forward, because that's what we all agreed to. That's how it was going to work. Now, the writing process, if you just isolate the writing process, I'm using the coloring process in that example, but if you isolate the writing process, it's very similar to how that's going to go. We had kind of agreed that the process for writing would be me, Gregory, and Matt get together chapter by chapter. We sort of talked about the book as a whole. We hammered out some of the big plot points we wanted there to be in the book as a whole. And then me, Matt, and Gregory were going to get together and we were going to go chapter by chapter. We kind of settled on, let's do 5 chapters, 5, think about it as 5 issues. We were originally going to maybe do single issue floppies, but then we decided not to. So each chapter is about 22 pages. Each chapter is roughly, it's not exactly, but roughly the size of a single floppy comic that you might find in a store. So think of five of those together, and you got, Last Breeds. Um, it's a little bit longer than that because some of the chapters we went a little extra, but we're kind of in that realm of like 22-ish pages for a chapter. So um, what that all means is, the three of us, we had the kind of broad strokes discussion of like what's going to happen in the story as a whole. And then we made this plan that we would get together, have these Zoom meetings, because Matt lives in California, me and Gregory in Winnipeg. We'd have these Zoom meetings where we would just sort of map out the the broad strokes of what we thought should happen in a chapter. And then we would often have in that same meeting or sometimes in a second meeting, we would actually go through the story beats. So what I mean by that is like not just what happens in the chapter in a broad way, but like what are the actual moments that matter in that plot of that chapter. So like this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. So you would kind of go scene by scene like that, and kind of get, this idea of how each big scene might go, the big moments, the big decisions, big things that happen in the plot, and so on. But we wouldn't necessarily like plan every single thing out. We're just going to get the core of it figured out. And then we will also have some actual lines, that would be, or some ideas for characters. All the characters would be developed in these meetings. All the really significant lines might get developed in these meetings. Particular major moments in the plot would get developed in these meetings, but there'd be a lot that was sort of not figured out yet. Just sort of the skeleton, what's the spine of the story? What's the skeleton of the chapter? And then I would go away and I would write a script. And when I say I would go away and write a script, what I mean is I would end up literally writing a script. And so I would write, about for a 22-page comic, I would write a script that was probably around the realm of 22 pages as well. So like I'm going to talk about some examples from chapter 4 a little bit later in the book, just because I think they're nice, interesting examples of how things kind of get translated and moved. But so my script for 4, it has 17 pages. And in fact, if you want to get really technical about it, my first script for 4 had 16 pages. My second script for 4 had 17 pages so what I would do, so now I'm in the process where I'm writing a script. Okay, so it's about 16, 17 pages when I'm done with it. How I'm writing that script is I'm sort of taking my notes from the meeting me, Gregory, and Matt had. So we've in that process worked out all the big things we think should happen. And the things we're really focused on in those meetings are twofold. So one, we're really focused on like, how are we going to kind of have things move through this chapter? So what's this chapter about, right? In the broader story, what place does it have in the story? Thematically, what is it about in the story? Plot-wise, what is it about? What part of the story is this? What are the big elements that need to be here? What are the things that have to happen to move the plot forward? But also, what are the things that have to happen to set up a later event or to pay off an earlier seed of an event? And so on and so forth. And artistically speaking, like what are the ideas we want to get across here? What are some of the images maybe or visual ideas we want to get across? What's just some of the cool action sequences? Is there a set piece, like some sort of cool thing that we want to happen that we think will be like a big moment in the book, and so on and so forth? So in chapter 4, for example, we've got a situation where they are coming we had these characters called the Long Pigs. We had this character of the sow that we had introduced in an earlier chapter. We really wanted the sow to be and kind of how her plot was developing to be one of the focuses in this chapter. We really wanted the threat of her to be intensifying throughout the chapter. We really wanted to get at the one of the premises in one of the core premise in Last Breeds is that due to this genetic problem that has been created through cloning food sources, this ends up with this genetic modification that starts to happen, and you basically get the Hayflick limit, which is the limit of the times your cells can divide before they die, gets shortened, and so humans end up having these lower Hayflick limits. You have children dying of old age effectively before they hit puberty, and sort of this is the cycle. It's a little bit more complicated than this, perhaps. We don't dig super deep into the science and bore everyone to death with science in this story, but there's a scientific sci-fi underpinning to the plot. So one of the things that you get caught up in this plot is the idea that children can't live past puberty. That's why this one girl is special. That's why they're trying to get her across the country to go to this lab and do these certain things. So we really wanted to have some kids die in this chapter. It sounds weird to say it that way, but the idea was we need to see, we need some discussion of this process. We need to kind of, as we're getting close to the end of the story, we really need to see the stakes a bit more fully. We don't really have, necessarily a lot of kids dying, but we're just getting at the idea of well, what happens? What happens? What's going to happen to these kids if they don't find the cure? Let's introduce some kids. Let's show sort of through some discussion and so on, what's going to happen to these kids if they don't figure this out. Intensify everything before our final chapter so that the stakes are in your face now. These are the same stakes we had before, but we're going to kind of visually show them to you and kind of talk about them a bit more and kind of, move into that space where before our final chapter, where we're going to have certain developments, you get some real clear sense of how things should go. Or are going to go if things go wrong, So again, we talk all about all these big ideas. Then I'm sitting down to write a script after these meetings. So my challenge as the writer at this stage is one, I have this list of notes. So I have all these, this checklist of sorts that I've got to get through. I've got all these ideas. Some of them are my ideas, some of them are other people's ideas. I've got to figure out how to synthesize all those ideas. And I've got to, figure out how it's going to work to get them in here. So the first thing I've got to do as a writer in this kind of process, and this, by the way, is a great example of the kind of thing that you'd have to do if you were being hired by another company. So if you're hired by a Hollywood production company, or if you're hired by a TV production company, if you're hired by some other company or some other person to write something, maybe you're going to adapt a licensed work, maybe you're going to write the next Star Wars movie, whatever you're going to do. If you're in this, you're going to end up in this sort of position where you've got a host of ideas and demands, a checklist of sorts that you have to kind of accomplish the creative tasks on this checklist. At the same time, you've got to figure out how to make this your own. And how to put your stamp on it, but not, too much of your stamp on it, and so on and so forth. So the first thing I would do, and what I always recommend in these sorts of scenarios, where you haven't just originated the idea. Like it's not just your baby. It's not just your idea. It's not just your thing you've come up with and you've got total control over, but you're part of a team, a writing team in this case. Um, the first thing I do is I go through the list and I just isolate what are the must do's, what are the would be nice kind of, if I would do it. And I'm talking from the creative point of view. So when you're getting told things like this by other creatives, all the ideas are, you got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do that. Everyone's excited about their ideas. Everyone likes their ideas. Maybe they like your ideas too, but the point is, what they're probably doing is they're probably giving you too many ideas. And also at the same time, they're probably not giving you enough ideas. So they're probably giving you too many things, like too much stuff to even fit in a script. But they're also probably leaving out the most important things that need to go in the script, which you can't really determine ahead of time. You can figure out some of the big plot points, but you can't always figure everything out. Like often when you're in the nuts and bolts of writing a script, what you realize is when you were outlining things, you were overlooking some of the back and forth characters reacting to one another stuff. So it's like maybe you have the idea that X should happen, but you've forgotten that Y needs to take place for the character to be motivated to make X happen. So you might have X, but you might not have Y, right? But Y is more important in a certain sense, because it's the only way to get to X. So you can be in those sorts of positions where you've probably got a big laundry list of things that everyone wants in this project. But the reality is that there's actually more things that need to be in here than is on the laundry list. And therefore, to get those other things in that haven't been thought of yet, to get these new ideas that are necessary into the script, probably a lot of the laundry list is going to have to go. But you're probably coming out of these meetings with no clear direction in that sense. Now, Matt and Gregory are both writers, so there wasn't a whole lot of that in our particular process. You'll see it more when you're dealing with producers who are not writers. So a lot of times producers who are not writers will just have they just won't understand the craft and the nuts and bolts of the process of writing. They won't know enough to give you what you need. Whereas, Gregory and Matt, being writers, could kind of see a bit more clearly what would be necessary in the writing process. And so we weren't really as much in that position as I would be when I've worked with other producers. But we're still a bit of that position of, I got to take all these notes. I got to take this big laundry list of what we want to have happen in this book, in this chapter. And I've got to go through it myself and just isolate almost into two columns what has to happen versus what's nice if I can get it in there. And then I have to focus. I have to ignore all the stuff that would be nice if I can get it in there. I have to just focus on, okay, what has to happen? How do I make that stuff work? And what you find immediately is next, you have to just go through the limitations. So the sort of next thing I always do in this process is I would go through the limitations. So in this case, the formal limitation was, how many pages can we afford to pay Scott to draw? Right. So in this example in chapter 2, I forget. Let me just look, actually, chapter 4, I should say. Chapter 4, yeah, I'm working on a 22-page script. So chapter 4, we've already predetermined that this is a 22-page chapter. We've got the budget for 22 pages, right? It can't be more than 22 pages. It shouldn't be less than 22 pages. 22 pages is what it is. So everything I need to get in this chapter has to fit inside those 22 pages. So the next thing that I do as a creative, since it's comics, since the form and its limitations are dictating certain things, is I get some cue cards. I get 22 cue cards, and I lay them out uh, on the ground or on a desk. And when I say I lay them out, I mean I get 22 pages and I lay them out like comics. So I lay them out as if I had a spread, going. So the first page in a comics is page one, right? Which in the script will be called page one, but also if you're looking through the book, I mean, I'm talking chapter four. Page one is really not page one. Is probably page 67 or something. But the point is, it's an odd numbered page. In books, odd numbered pages are on the right. Even numbered pages are on the left. And so first you lay out one card, which is page one of the chapter, right? Then underneath that card, I would put two cards side by side, one for the left and one for the right. And again, I just want to visualize, and I just keep putting like two cards down like that for, page 2, 3, 4, 5, because I want to see, and I would number them too. I would number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so I can see like where each thing is at. The last page of the chapter is going to be 22 in comics. Again, 22 is a left-hand page. I put that down. So then, I've got this page at the front, page at the back, and I've got these spreads in between, these 10 spreads in between. Each one is a 2-page spread. Page at the front, page at the back, that's 2 pages. And then 10 2-page spreads, that's another 20 pages. That gives us 22 pages. That's the physical structure of how the chapter lays out. So the next thing I got to do, now that I see the physical structure of the chapter in front of me, is I have to write on the cards, where do these laundry list things go? So again, I'm going to start with the big things, and I'm going to figure out like, well, where can they go? Where can I fit them in this chapter? And again, I need to physically figure out like what space is it going to occupy? Because the other thing you kind of have to get a feel for is, where do the spreads go? If you've got a big moment, like a big action moment, for example, probably you want that to be a splash page, or maybe a really big panel, or maybe you even want it to be a spread across 2 pages for some reason, right? Well, how much physical space that moment is going to take up, that story moment is going to take up in the issue, is really important. So this is sort of called, sometimes I call this like getting the big rocks in the story. There's a parable from somewhere. I think it's from professional development literature, actually. But the parable sort of is, if you have a bunch of rocks and you try to throw them all into a container, then they don't fit. How do you get the rocks in the container when there's too many to fit? Well, the only way to do it, is, if you had a bunch of sand and a bunch of big boulders, you put the sand in, then you throw the boulders on top, they don't fit. But if you put the boulders in first, like the big rocks in first, and then you pour the sand in, the sand will just fill around it'll flow around like water almost. It'll fill in all the little spaces. You can get it to fit. Whereas if you put the sand in first, it just occupies one big space. It's in the way. Things piling on top of it will start flowing out the top of the container. So if you take that metaphorical idea and apply it to the story, I think it holds true. If you just get those big moments, like on my laundry list of stuff that has to happen in this issue, this chapter, what is the coolest looking thing that should be drawn big? What is like the most, visually interesting moment? What's a sort of big emotional moment that needs to occupy some space? What's a big cool action beat? What's just a cool looking picture that would be fun for Scott to draw, and therefore he'll do a really good job drawing? That could, I want to figure out all those big rocks of like, what's going to take physically the biggest space on these pages, which is, of course, ideally also emotionally, what is the biggest moments in the story, plot wise, the biggest events in the story. all those things sort of are analoged as taking up the most amount of physical space on the pages. You also have to take into account the parameters of this left-right page numbering, because of course in comics, if you want something to be a surprise, it has to be on an even numbered page, not an odd numbered page. That's just sort of how your eye is going to, when you turn the page, you're turning an odd numbered page to an even numbered page. So if you want, so the most effective place to put a surprise or a revelation is on the page turn, right? You can cliffhanger, you want a cliffhanger at the end of every odd numbered page. You want a surprise at the start of every even numbered page. That's sort of the math of the plot structure of comics in that sense. And then also you have to keep into account, so like where I can put certain things sometimes, like certain story moments or certain information revelations, or certain visuals that give us information or show us something shocking. Where I can put those things is also limited by the formal elements. And this is where the cards come in really handy, right? Plus, I want to think about, spreads. Do I have like pairs of things that were like the left and the right side of the left and the right side of the book? Are things going to work together, like to have a kind of interesting spread if someone was physically flipping through a book, right? Because we want sort of, the page to operate as a unit. We want the panel to work as a unit, but we also have these like really cool spreads that maybe want to get in there. So these are the sorts of things that, again, I need to figure out early in the writing process. This is sort of after we've come up with our basic plan as a group. Then as I'm sitting down to write, an actual script that can be handed to Scott, the question is, how do we do this sort of thing?